The year was 2189, and humanity had taken its first steps onto the grand stage of galactic politics. After years of exploration, war, and diplomacy, the Earth finally received an invitation to join the Galactic Concord, a coalition of diverse alien species. The invitation was historic, a moment of pride for Earth and its people. It was a moment that would change everything. Lieutenant Adrian Hale sat in the spacious, pristine briefing room aboard the Earth cruiser Pride of Sol. His fingers drummed nervously on the table as he glanced at the holographic map that shimmered before him. In the center of the galaxy, on the planet Zorva, the Zorvani awaited humanity's arrival. Adrian was not a diplomat. He was a xenobiologist, trained in the study of alien life and culture. But this mission had a special significance. The Zorvani were a species of incredible intelligence and advancement, and their society had once been a model of success. Now, however, they were facing a crisis, one that no amount of technology or medical science had been able to solve. They were struggling to reproduce. Adrian's role was simple. He was there to assist Ambassador Calera, a Zorvani representative, in studying human biology in the hopes of finding a solution to their problem. The Zorvani were an ancient species, one that had refined themselves to the point of near perfection. Their physical and mental capabilities were unmatched by any other species in the galaxy. Yet, despite their advanced biology, they had encountered a strange and mysterious infertility crisis. No matter how they tried, they could not reproduce in the numbers needed to sustain their population. The Zorvani were proud, and their pride had only grown stronger with each passing century. They viewed their species as the pinnacle of evolution, a species that had transcended the need for struggle. To ask for help from humanity, an upstart species still in the early stages of interstellar exploration, was a humiliating prospect. But desperation had a way of breaking down even the strongest pride. Adrian's shuttle landed on Zorva's surface, a planet that was as beautiful as it was foreboding. Towering crystal spires gleamed in the distant sunlight, and the air was thick with the scent of a strange, sweet flora. The Zorvani capital city, Reshkeler, was a work of art, an intricate mix of organic and metallic structures, blending seamlessly with the natural landscape. There was no doubt that the Zorvani had mastered technology, and their cities reflected their sophisticated, almost utopian society. As Adrian stepped off the shuttle, a tall figure greeted him. Calera was a striking sight. She stood nearly 2 meters tall, her form elegant and poised, draped in shimmering robes of silver and blue. Her skin was smooth and flawless, with a soft glow that gave her an almost ethereal appearance. Her eyes, however, were the most striking. Deep, golden pools of intelligence and calculation, yet there was a sharpness to them that spoke of centuries of wisdom and pride. Lieutenant Hale, Calera's voice was cool and measured, with a faint trace of curiosity. "Welcome to Zorva. We are eager to begin." Adrian bowed slightly, his usual confident demeanor slipping a little under the weight of her gaze. "Thank you, Ambassador Calera. It's an honor to be here." She studied him for a moment, her golden eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Your species is different," she said, her tone thoughtful. "We had expected a more advanced approach to our problem, not the chaos of your genetics, but we will see what your kind can offer." Adrian felt a slight discomfort, but he didn't let it show. He had read all the reports on the Zorvani's pride, and he knew that Calera's words were not meant to be insulting. It was simply the way of her people, a way of thinking that viewed themselves as being at the apex of everything. "I understand your concerns," Adrian said diplomatically, "but I assure you, the human genome has certain, unique qualities that you might find helpful." Calera gave a small nod, but her expression remained unreadable. "We will see. Follow me." The walk to the Zorvani research facility was long, though Adrian didn't mind. He was fascinated by the planet, by the technology, and by the Zorvani themselves. The more he observed, the more he realized that despite their incredible advancements, There was something deeply human about the Zorvani. The way they interacted with each other, the emotions they concealed behind their stoic facades, it was all so familiar, so relatable. As they entered the facility, Adrian marveled at the advanced equipment around them. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a mix of biological and technological wonders that seemed to blur the lines between the two. He was eager to get started, but there was an underlying tension, a sense that both he and Cal-Era were walking into unknown territory. "Let us begin," Cal-Era said, gesturing to a series of high-tech biotanks. "We have much to learn from each other." Adrian nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a diplomatic mission. It was the beginning of a new chapter for humanity. The Zorvani had been facing their crisis alone for so long, and now they had turned to humanity, of all species, for help. The stakes were higher than ever. Little did Adrian know, the journey ahead would not only change the Zorvani's future, but would also reveal surprising things about humanity's place in the galaxy. The answer to the Zorvani's infertility problem lay in humanity's very DNA, and that discovery would alter the course of galactic history forever. Days passed, and Adrian felt himself becoming more and more immersed in the Zorvani research. The lab, though impressive, was cold and clinical, filled with complex machinery that seemed almost alive in its precision. He and Cal-Era worked side by side, studying the intricacies of the human and Zorvani genetic codes. The Zorvani, with their advanced knowledge of biology, had always believed that they were near perfect, their genetic makeup carefully engineered to eliminate flaws. But despite their perfection, they couldn't overcome the mysterious infertility that plagued their species. Adrian was fascinated by how the Zorvani had managed to advance so far, yet he could see that their methods had left them in a kind of biological dead end. Their carefully controlled evolution had created a species with no room for adaptation, and that had become their weakness. Human genetics, on the other hand, were far messier, more chaotic in some ways, but also more flexible. Adrian couldn't help but feel that humanity's imperfections might be the key to solving the Zorvani's crisis. Each day, Adrian would sit in front of one of the biotanks, working on mapping out the human genome against the Zorvani's. He was surprised by the similarities between the two species. Both had highly advanced intellects, both were capable of intricate technological feats, and both had similar lifespans and physical traits. But it was the differences that stood out. Humans were adaptable, capable of thriving in a variety of environments, while the Zorvani had become almost stagnant in their pursuit of perfection. Cal-Era, too, seemed to be growing more interested in the process. At first, she had been distant, almost dismissive of the human contribution. But slowly, Adrian noticed a shift. She started to ask questions, her curiosity about human biology growing. She was a scientist, after all, and even her pride couldn't stop her from appreciating the unique qualities of the human genome. One afternoon, as Adrian was deep in his work, Cal-Era walked into the lab holding a small datapad. She was silent for a moment, observing him as he worked. "You're focused," she said, her voice softer than usual. Adrian looked up, slightly surprised. "I have to be. This is incredible. The similarities between our species are fascinating." Cal-Era nodded. "We are alike in many ways. Perhaps we underestimated you, but it is the differences that concern us. We have perfected ourselves to a point where we are unable to evolve further. The Zorvani genome is locked, unchanging. If we cannot adapt, we will die. We may be the last of our kind." Adrian frowned. "But you're not the last. Not yet. We have something that might help." She tilted her head, intrigued. "You speak of your human DNA. I have seen your reports, but your genetics are so chaotic. Your species is filled with imperfections. I do not understand how that could be a solution." "It's precisely those imperfections that make us so adaptable," Adrian explained. "Our genome isn't fixed. It's always changing, always reacting to new environments and challenges. It's why we can thrive in so many different conditions, And that flexibility is what the Zorveni need. Kalera's golden eyes narrowed as she considered his words. But your species is far less stable. You suffer from diseases, mutations, and weaknesses that we have long since eliminated in our own genetics. Adrian couldn't help but smile. True. But those very weaknesses also give us strength. We're able to overcome what you might call flaws. Our bodies can fight off things that would destroy a more perfect species. And that's something your people need. You've created a genome that can't fight back when faced with a challenge. But with a little human influence, that could change. Kalera was silent for a moment, her mind clearly processing what Adrian had said. She was a brilliant scientist, and for the first time since their collaboration began, Adrian could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was beginning to see the potential. I see, Kalera finally said, her voice almost hesitant. Perhaps we were wrong. Perhaps perfection is not the answer. But there is still much we do not understand. How can we be certain that human genetics will not have unforeseen consequences? Adrian's eyes sparkled with determination. I don't know for sure, but I believe it's worth the risk. If we can combine the best of both species, human adaptability and Zorveni precision, we might be able to solve your problem. Kalera studied him carefully, her gaze sharp. You truly believe that? I do, Adrian replied confidently. It's the only way forward. The Zorveni ambassador stood tall, her mind clearly made up. Then we shall proceed. But be warned, human, if your solution fails, it will not be my people who suffer. It will be you. Adrian didn't flinch. He understood the stakes. The Zorveni were a powerful species, and if his solution didn't work, the consequences could be far-reaching. But he wasn't afraid. He had always believed that humanity's greatest strength lay in its ability to adapt, to overcome, and to find solutions when all hope seemed lost. He wasn't going to let pride or fear stop him from trying. We'll make it work, Adrian said, his voice firm. I promise. And so the unlikely partnership continued, with Adrian and Kalera working together to unlock the potential of their species. The Zorveni may have been hesitant at first, but slowly the walls began to come down. For the first time in a long time, Kalera allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, humanity's messy, imperfect biology might be the key to saving her people. The days that followed were filled with long hours in the lab, as Adrian and Kalera worked together, focused on a new and groundbreaking approach to Zorveni fertility. They had gathered human and Zorveni genetic data, analyzing it with a level of precision that only Kalera's technology could provide. Adrian couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with nervousness. They were standing on the brink of something extraordinary. Kalera had begun to show more interest in human biology, and Adrian could see her admiration growing. Her stoic nature had softened, and she began to ask more questions, eager to understand the human genome's remarkable flexibility. But beneath her curiosity, Adrian also sensed a deep reluctance. It was clear that, while she had begun to see the value in human genetics, she still struggled with the idea of relying on something as chaotic and unpredictable as humanity's biology. As they worked late into one evening, Kalera paused, her fingers hovering over a holographic display. This is extraordinary, she murmured, her voice softer than usual. I didn't expect such a reaction. Adrian stepped closer to the display, his curiosity piqued. On the screen, the results of the latest experiment were unfolding. They had introduced a small sample of human genetic material into a Zorveni cell culture. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, something unexpected happened. The cells began to react in ways that neither of them had anticipated. Instead of simply absorbing the human material as they had expected, the Zorveni cells began to divide and grow at an accelerated rate. It was as though the human genetics had awakened something dormant in the Zorveni cells, something that had been locked away for centuries. Adrian frowned, his heart racing. This isn't supposed to happen. The cells, they're reacting too quickly. We didn't anticipate this kind of growth. Kellera's golden eyes widened as she watched the data stream across the holographic screen. "This isn't just growth," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is evolution." Adrian's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He had read about the Zorvani's genetic perfection, how their species had locked their evolution in place centuries ago, striving for a flawless balance. But this reaction was something entirely new. The Zorvani cells were undergoing rapid changes, as if they were being nudged toward a new phase of development, a phase they had not experienced in millennia. Kellera turned toward him, her expression a mixture of awe and fear. "Your human genetics, they are doing something we cannot control. This reaction is not something we engineered. It's chaotic, unpredictable." Adrian swallowed hard, his mind still struggling to process what was happening. He had expected some kind of reaction, but not this. He had hoped that the human genetic material would help the Zorvani adapt, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The Zorvani were not ready for such a powerful and uncontrollable force. Their pride had made them perfect, but it had also made them fragile. I don't understand," Adrian stammered. "This shouldn't be happening. The cells should be absorbing the human material slowly, not evolving like this." Kellera's voice grew more urgent. "We need to stop this. If this continues, we don't know what could happen. The Zorvani genome is stable. It has been for centuries. This disruption could cause irreparable damage." Adrian's heart raced as he quickly typed commands into the console, trying to halt the process. But the cells seemed to be beyond his control, continuing to divide and mutate with an alarming speed. Panic set in as Adrian realized that they were no longer in control of the experiment. The Zorvani genetic material was adapting too rapidly, far beyond what they had ever predicted. Kellera's hands trembled as she watched the data. "What have we done?" she whispered, a sense of dread filling her voice. Adrian's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had crossed a line, one they couldn't uncross. They had introduced human genetics into the Zorvani genome, and now the cells were reacting in ways that neither of them understood. The Zorvani's perfect world was being shaken by something they could not control, and there was no way to predict the outcome. "Kellera," Adrian said, his voice steady but strained. "We need to contain this. We need to analyze the results and figure out what's happening. We can't let panic cloud our judgment." Kellera nodded, but her expression was grim. "You're right, but we cannot ignore what is happening. This is not just an experiment anymore. This is a shift in the very fabric of our biology, and if we don't understand it soon, we may be too late to stop it." The lab was filled with an eerie silence as they both watched the data unfold, the Zorvani cells continuing to evolve at an unimaginable rate. It was as though the human genetic material had unlocked something deep within them, something that had been dormant for centuries. The result was something neither of them had anticipated, and neither of them knew how to stop it. As the hours passed, the growth slowed, and the lab finally quieted. Adrian and Kellera stood side by side, staring at the screen in stunned silence. They had just witnessed the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted, a new chapter in the Zorvani's history. But whether it would be a blessing or a curse, neither of them could say. Adrian couldn't shake the unease that settled over him as he stood in the silent lab. The unexpected growth in the Zorvani cells had left him feeling both awed and terrified. He had hoped to find a way to help the Zorvani overcome their infertility crisis, but he had never anticipated the startling reaction that had occurred. The cells had evolved, shifting in ways that seemed to defy everything they knew about Zorvani biology. Kellera had remained quiet for hours, her golden eyes fixed on the data streams, analyzing the results. She was the first to break the silence, her voice steady but laced with concern. "This is unlike anything I've ever seen," she said, her tone low. "The Zorvani genome is changing. It's as if it's been awakened from a deep sleep. We've never had anything like this before. Adrian nodded, his mind racing. It's the human genetics. They triggered something dormant inside your cells. I don't know why or how, but it's clear that your people's genetic code is responding to the human material in ways we can't control. Cal-Era took a deep breath, her gaze still locked on the data. I underestimated it. I thought your species was primitive. I thought we could simply study your biology, take what we needed, and move on. But now, she trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. Adrian could feel the weight of her words, the gravity of what they had done. This was no longer just a scientific experiment. This was something much bigger, something that had the potential to change the future of both their species. But the uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on him. He had always been confident in humanity's adaptability, in the belief that their greatest strength was their ability to change, to overcome. But now, as he looked at the swirling data on the screen, he wasn't so sure. This could be the answer to your infertility problem, Adrian said quietly. But we have no idea what the long-term effects will be. Your people's biology is no longer what it was. It's evolving. Cal-Era's eyes narrowed, her voice tinged with disbelief. Evolving. In real time. That's not possible. My people perfected our genetics centuries ago. We've removed all weaknesses, all flaws. There's no room for evolution to occur. It's locked. It's been locked. And yet it's happening, Adrian said, his voice firm. We've triggered something in your genome that has been dormant for centuries. Something your people couldn't even begin to understand. Cal-Era was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened. I've always believed that perfection was the key. We Zorvani sought to eliminate all imperfections, to make ourselves better, stronger, smarter. But now I see, we've limited ourselves. We've closed the door to possibilities. Adrian studied her for a moment. He had never seen the proud Zorvani ambassador so vulnerable before. The Zorvani had always seen themselves as the pinnacle of evolution, a species that had overcome all weaknesses. They were used to being the strongest, the most advanced species in the galaxy. But now, for the first time, Cal-Era was faced with the realization that their perfection had become their greatest flaw. We can't go back, Cal-Era said quietly, almost to herself. Once the door is opened, there's no closing it. Adrian nodded. I know. But we also can't move forward without understanding the consequences. We need to study this further. We need to figure out exactly what's happening and what it means for your people. Cal-Era met his gaze, her expression hardening with resolve. You're right. We can't afford to make hasty decisions, but we also can't afford to ignore what we've discovered. This could be the answer we've been searching for, but we have to be careful. Adrian's mind raced as he thought of the implications. They were standing at the edge of something monumental, but the uncertainty of it all was overwhelming. What if the changes were irreversible? What if, instead of helping the Zorvani, they had set in motion a process that would be uncontrollable, dangerous even? He had no answers, only questions, and a growing sense of responsibility. Over the following days, Adrian and Cal-Era worked together tirelessly, running test after test, studying the rapidly evolving cells. They isolated specific factors in the human genetics that seemed to be driving the changes in the Zorvani cells, and they began to identify patterns. But the more they discovered, the more questions arose. There were signs that the Zorvani were adapting in ways they hadn't expected. New traits were emerging, some beneficial, some perhaps not. The accelerated growth had slowed, but the shifts in the cell's behavior seemed to be stabilizing, as though the genetic evolution had found a new equilibrium. But the consequences of this newfound adaptability were still unclear. Cal-Era was no longer the cold, proud ambassador she had once been. She was a scientist now, driven by the need to understand, to control what they had set in motion. Adrian watched her as she worked, her sharp mind consumed with the data. He saw the same determination in her that he had seen in himself when he first started his studies. But there was something else, something more personal, in her eyes now. Doubt, perhaps, or even fear. The Zorvani had spent centuries building their perfect society, but it was clear that they could not remain perfect forever. They needed change. They needed adaptability. And that was something humanity, in all its messy, chaotic brilliance, had in abundance. "What if we're wrong?" Adrian asked one evening, his voice quiet. "What if this change is more than your people can handle?" Caldera looked up from her work, her golden eyes meeting his. "Then we'll face the consequences, together." The days seemed to blur together as Adrian and Caldera delved deeper into their research. The unexpected changes in the Zorvani cells had shaken both of them. But the more they studied, the more they realized they were standing on the precipice of something far bigger than they had ever imagined. What had started as an experiment to help the Zorvani with their infertility had evolved into something much more complex. The Zorvani were changing, and no one knew what the outcome would be. Adrian sat at the lab table, his eyes scanning the data once again. Despite the progress they had made, the uncertainty still gnawed at him. The Zorvani genome was adapting, evolving at an unprecedented rate, and though some of the changes seemed to offer hope for their species, others were more concerning. New genetic traits were emerging, but their full impact remained a mystery. Caldera stood across the room, her arms crossed as she examined the results on the holoscreen. She had become quieter lately, her thoughts clouded by the gravity of the situation. Once proud and confident, she now seemed more conflicted, caught between the promise of a solution and the fear of unintended consequences. "Adrian," she said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking. These changes, they're not just biological, are they? The longer we observe them, the more it seems like something deeper is happening." Adrian looked up, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Caldera turned to face him fully, her golden eyes searching his face for understanding. "It's not just the cells dividing faster or evolving in unpredictable ways. The changes, they're affecting more than just our biology. They're affecting our very nature. Our minds, our emotions, our society, our entire way of life is at risk." Adrian's heart skipped a beat. He had been so focused on the scientific side of things, the genetics and the biology, that he hadn't considered the larger, more profound implications of what they were doing. The Zorvani had always prided themselves on their intellect, their logic, their control. But now, with this new infusion of human adaptability, there was a chance that everything they had worked for could unravel. "You're saying that the changes could affect your society?" Adrian asked carefully. Caldera nodded slowly. "I fear that they already are. We've already seen signs of it. We're becoming more impulsive, more emotional. We're losing the restraint we once had. If this continues, we could lose everything: our sense of self, our unity, our identity." Adrian could see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just fear of physical changes. It was the fear of losing the very essence of what it meant to be Zorvani. He could understand that. Humanity had long struggled with its own identity, its own sense of purpose. But the Zorvani had always been sure of themselves, their place in the galaxy. Now that certainty was in jeopardy. "I didn't realize," Adrian began, his voice trailing off. "I was so focused on helping your people with their biological issues, I didn't consider how this might affect you, emotionally or socially." Caldera's expression softened, but there was still a deep sadness in her gaze. "It's not just the biology. It's everything. We thought we had reached perfection, but perfection comes at a cost. We've sacrificed so much in the name of stability. And now, in an attempt to save ourselves, we may have set in motion something we cannot control." Adrian felt the weight of her words. He had wanted to help. He had believed that combining the flexibility of humanity with the precision of the Zorvani would create something extraordinary, something that would solve their problems. But now, it seemed that the solution might bring even greater challenges. Was the cost of salvation worth the risk of losing everything the Zorvani had built? "Is there a way to reverse it?" Adrian asked, almost as if speaking the question aloud might bring some clarity. If you're starting to lose control, is there any way to stop the changes? Calera shook her head, her shoulders slumping. I don't know. We've never faced anything like this. It's as if our genetics have been unlocked. It's not just about adapting to new challenges. It's as if we're evolving in ways we can't predict, and we can't stop it. Adrian sat back, his mind racing. He had to find a way out of this. He couldn't let the Zorvani lose their identity, their culture, their very essence. But he didn't have all the answers. They were working in uncharted territory, and every decision they made seemed to push them further into the unknown. The lad was silent for a long while, the hum of the machinery the only sound that filled the room. Adrian and Calera both stared at the data, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Adrian spoke, his voice filled with resolve. We have to keep going. We can't stop now. If there's even a chance that we can help your people without losing everything you've worked for, we have to take it. Calera met his gaze, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. I agree, but we need to move carefully. Every step we take from here on out must be calculated. We've seen what happens when we act recklessly. Adrian nodded, knowing that they were both walking a fine line. The path ahead was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than ever before. The future of the Zorvani, and perhaps even humanity itself, rested in their hands. We'll do this together, Adrian said quietly. We'll figure it out, but we have to be careful. The balance is delicate. And so they continued their work, knowing that each decision could have far-reaching consequences. The discovery they had made was both a blessing and a curse, and they would need to navigate its complexities with caution if they were to avoid losing everything. Adrian and Calera worked through the next few weeks in a near-constant state of tension. The data continued to flood in, each new test revealing more about the unexpected evolution of the Zorvani genome. It was clear that something extraordinary was happening, but what that would ultimately mean for the future, neither of them could predict. Each morning, Adrian entered the lab with a sense of dread and anticipation. The changes in the Zorvani were becoming more noticeable, not just at a genetic level, but in how they behaved. They had become more restless, more emotional, as Calera had feared. In the city outside the lab, whispers of unrest had begun to spread. The perfect, disciplined society of the Zorvani was starting to fracture, and no one knew how to fix it. One afternoon, as they pored over the latest results, Calera's voice broke through the silence. Adrian, we need to talk. He looked up, sensing the urgency in her tone. She was standing near the display, her eyes fixed on the data scrolling across the screen. There was a strange tension in the air, as though something important was about to be revealed. What is it? Adrian asked, walking over to her. Calera turned to face him, her expression more serious than he had ever seen it. I've been thinking a lot about the direction we're going in. The changes in our people, they're becoming harder to ignore. The shift in our biology is just the beginning. There's something deeper happening, something we didn't foresee. Adrian's heart sank. He had feared this moment. The changes in the Zorvani had been subtle at first, but now they were becoming more pronounced. What if the evolution they had set in motion was something uncontrollable, something that would tear apart everything the Zorvani had built? What do you mean? Adrian asked carefully. Calera's gaze was troubled. I think we're at a turning point. The changes are starting to affect our emotions, our actions. Some of my people are becoming unpredictable. We've always valued logic and restraint, but now there's an undercurrent of chaos. People are questioning our laws, our leaders. There's fear, anger, uncertainty, things that we've never had to deal with before. Adrian swallowed hard. He had hoped that the changes would be temporary, that they would stabilize. But it seemed that the Zorvani were heading towards something irreversible. What had started as an attempt to help had now become a potential catalyst for the downfall of an entire society. We need to contain this, Adrian said, trying to hold on to his sense of urgency. If your people are losing control, it's only going to get worse. We need to stop the evolution before it spreads any further. Kelleher shook her head slowly. It's too late for that. The changes are already too deep. I'm seeing it in the way we interact with each other, the way we think. We can't just reverse it, Adrian. We've crossed a line. A heavy silence filled the room as both of them absorbed the weight of her words. There was no going back now. They had awakened something within the Zorvani, a force of evolution that couldn't be undone. So what do we do now? Adrian asked, his voice tight with frustration. If we can't reverse the changes, how do we stop the chaos? Kelleher took a deep breath, her expression hardening with determination. We have to adapt. We have to learn how to live with these changes, not fight them. We can't go back to the way things were, but maybe we don't need to. Perhaps this new path is something we can build a future on. We need to find a way to integrate these changes into our society without losing ourselves. Adrian frowned. He had never thought of it this way. He had always believed that change was something to be controlled, something to be measured. But Kelleher's words made him reconsider. Maybe this was the next step in the evolution of their species, not something to be feared but embraced. But how do we do that? Adrian asked, his voice tinged with doubt. How do we integrate these changes without losing everything that made the Zorvani who they are? Kelleher's eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him. We start by acknowledging the change. We don't hide from it or try to suppress it. We accept that we are evolving, that we are becoming something new. The Zorvani have always been a people who prided themselves on their perfection, but perfection can be limiting. Perhaps it's time to embrace the imperfections that come with change. Adrian met her gaze, his mind racing. She was right. Perhaps they had been too focused on control, too focused on the idea of perfection. Change wasn't something to fear. It was a natural part of life. And now, the Zorvani had the opportunity to shape a future that was far more adaptable, more flexible than they had ever imagined. As the hours passed, Adrian and Kelleher began to discuss new ideas, how to help the Zorvani embrace their new reality, how to find a way forward in a world that was rapidly changing. They weren't alone in this anymore. They had both crossed a threshold, and together, they would face the unknown future. Later that evening, Kelleher stood at the window, looking out at the city below. The Zorvani were struggling, but there was hope. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would walk it together, adapting and evolving with every step. Adrian joined her, standing silently by her side. They both knew that the future was no longer something they could control, but it was something they could shape. We'll find a way, Adrian said quietly, more to himself than to her. Kelleher turned to him, her eyes filled with a new sense of resolve. Yes, we will. Together. As the weeks passed, the Zorvani continued to adapt to the changes that had overtaken their species. The society that had once been a shining example of precision and perfection was now on the brink of transformation. The restlessness, the emotional outbursts, and the newfound unpredictability were no longer seen as problems to be solved. They were accepted as part of the process, part of the evolution the Zorvani had inadvertently set into motion. Adrian and Kelleher spent countless hours working side by side, attempting to guide the Zorvani through this new reality. They were no longer fighting against the change. Instead, they were learning to live with it, shaping it, trying to understand its deeper meaning. The world outside the lab was changing too. The unrest had not vanished completely, but there was a sense of cautious optimism that had begun to take hold. It was as though the Zorvani were finally acknowledging that they didn't need to be perfect to be great. They could be something more, something evolving. One morning, as Adrian reviewed the latest findings, Kelleher entered the lab, her expression thoughtful. Her golden eyes no longer carried the same heavy weight they once did. There was a new light in them, a sense of purpose that had been missing in the early days after the changes began. "We've come a long way," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet pride. Adrian looked up from the data. "We have," It feels like the entire galaxy is watching us. Kalhara nodded. We are at the crossroads of a new era, not just for the Zorvani, but for humanity as well. What we've done, what we've discovered, has the potential to change everything. Adrian frowned slightly. But it's also dangerous. We still don't fully understand the extent of the changes. We don't know what the future holds for either of our species. I know, Kalhara replied. But sometimes, the unknown is the most important part of growth. For too long, we've resisted change, fearing what might happen if we allowed ourselves to evolve. But now, we're embracing it. Her words echoed in Adrian's mind. The Zorvani had always been a people of strict control, perfection, and predictability. But what they had discovered, through the strange combination of their biology and humanity's adaptability, was that growth came not from perfection, but from the willingness to face the unknown. That's true, Adrian agreed. Leaning back in his chair, change is always unpredictable. But it's also the only constant we have. We can either resist it and risk stagnation, or we can embrace it and see where it takes us. Kalhara smiled slightly. I never imagined that a human would be the one to teach me this. Adrian returned the smile, but there was a somberness in his expression. I never imagined we'd be in this position either, but here we are, together. And we've learned something that neither of our species could have achieved alone. For a moment, the room was silent as they both reflected on how far they had come. The Zorvani were not the same as they had been, nor were humans. But in a strange way, they had found common ground. Both species had learned that there was strength in flexibility, in adaptability, and in the willingness to face the future without fear. Later that day, Kalhara held a council meeting with the leaders of the Zorvani. It was a historic moment, a gathering of minds, a merging of ideas, and a collective decision to embrace the changes that were reshaping their world. Adrian sat quietly in the back, watching the exchange with a mixture of awe and nervous anticipation. This was the beginning of something new, something far beyond what either of them could have envisioned. The council members were hesitant at first, unsure how to respond to the new reality that had emerged. But Kalhara spoke with a quiet authority, her voice calm yet powerful as she addressed the room. We cannot deny what has happened, she said. The changes in our biology are real, and they are profound, but they do not define us. It is not the loss of control that matters. It is how we adapt to it. We are not the perfect beings we once believed ourselves to be, but perhaps in our imperfection, we can find something greater. There was a long pause, and then one by one, the council members nodded. The fear, the uncertainty began to lift. They were ready to move forward. They were ready to embrace change, to face the future with open eyes and open hearts. The council session ended with an air of cautious optimism. The Zorvani were not ready to abandon their identity, but they had learned to open their minds to new possibilities. And humanity, Adrian in particular, had played an essential role in helping them understand that the future was not something to be feared, but something to be shaped. As Adrian and Kalhara walked out of the council hall together, they felt the weight of the world lift slightly. It wasn't over. The challenges were far from gone, and the future was still uncertain. But for the first time, both of them felt that they had the strength to face whatever came next. We did it, Adrian said, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Kalhara looked at him, her golden eyes soft with appreciation. No, Adrian, we're doing it, and together we will continue to shape the future, one step at a time. The future was still a vast, unknown expanse, but now, Adrian and Kalhara knew that they could navigate it. Together, they had opened a door to a new world, and there was no turning back. The dawn of a new era had arrived.